Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for staying till the last panel, and thank you for including me as a sociologist into the discussion. Sometimes we make a joke to our students that usually we ask for a doctor in the room, but sometimes we ask for a sociologist in the room. So today I will be talking about psychedelics, specifically the regulation of psychedelic when it comes to their compliance or fitting into clinical trials. So this is a part of my project that I have conducted since 2020, and it's kind of ongoing. So also during the pandemic, I don't know if you have noticed, but there was the psychedelics became a thing, right? There was more discussion about psychedelics. They became present in the media. There was discussion about companies investing in psychedelics. So luckily, it was the time that I started this research. And I was planning to do ethnography with Health Canada to see how Health Canada is regulating or what kind of challenges it faces. But because of pandemic, I was not able to do in-person ethnography. So I reverted to virtual ethnography, kind of digital ethnography, which I followed media, but also I conducted interviews with psychedelic advocates. So advocates who are coming from different standpoints, researchers involved in psychedelic trials, psychologists, non-profit organization, and was trying to see what kind of regime they're trying to develop and what kind of interests are invested in those development of those regimes. So this part is just a bit of a small part of my project, very much recent part of the project, because it refers to the recent decision of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in the US, that in 2024 rejected the submission for approval of MDMA for PTSD. So I'm just going to talk about it, what this decision can tell us, what kind of confirms in terms of problems with trying psychedelics through randomized control clinical trials. So psychedelics are the one way which our psychedelics are picked up in the current legal landscape is through developing them as medicine, right? So some may say, well, there are efforts to decriminalize, and true, but the most, I would say, advanced and probably the most likely way that psychedelics will come part of the legal landscape, it will be through becoming a medicine, approved as a medical treatment. So psychedelics are heralded as cures for post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anorexia, and attempts to trial psychedelics are increasing. And if you go to the government, US government, well, I don't think it's US government, but the website, clinical trials, you can see how many different types of clinical trials related to psychedelics are ongoing. In the US, in Canada, and elsewhere. To this date, only Australia, since last year, has legalized psychedelics as medical treatment. But again, those psychedelics are legalized as substances without being adjunct to therapies. So it's a bit different what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the case of MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. That is one of the most prominent organization and the longest lasting advocate for legalization for medical purposes of psychedelics. And their clinical trials were the most advanced. So they were trying to regulate and get approval of FDA for MDMA for PTSD, where the MDMA just served as an adjunct to therapy. So it was a psychedelic assisted therapy. So not just regulation of psychedelic, but psychedelic assisted therapy. So the discussion and consideration that I have is to what extent psychedelic-assisted therapies and trying of psychedelics can fit into the standards of clinical trials when we have different phases of clinical trials and specific objectives, and to what extent characteristic of psychedelic-assisted therapies troubles this kind of process of approval. And what I would like to say, maybe we should think about psychedelic-assisted therapies in terms of hybridity, and maybe there is a need of a new pathway to regulate psychedelic-assisted therapies. And I think this could apply also to therapies or with artificial intelligence, with machine learning, something that is novel and doesn't fit very easily into the categorization of drugs or devices, right? Because there's something else. So what I'm kind of seeing is like clinical trials are being expanded, and I think it's still not doing the work that it should be doing. So maybe there's another way to approach those kind of novel, non-standard therapies when it comes to generating scientific data for regulatory approval. So let me start. Oh, I forgot that. All right, so I will start with the decision FDA. FDA rejected MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD in 2024. And in the span of the few months, MAPS, that was later converted into Lykos, became a commercial entity, that was the sponsor that submitted data for FDA consideration and for the approval. So Lykos MAPS was the front runner, as I said, in the race to bring psychedelics into mainstream. And this case of Lykos and the rejection became a cautionary tale for other sponsors that are developing those psychedelic-assisted therapies or psychedelic therapies. So when it came to rejection in 2024, the rejection actually happened after the advisory committee to FDA or psychopharmacology also rejected it. So I was lucky to be present during the whole committee deliberation because it was online. It lasted for 8 hours. And the transcript, if you are interested, is 800 pages. My RA is currently reviewing it. But it was really interesting because there was such a certainty that this therapy would be approved. It was just a matter of time. All the commercial hype was generated around it, and the training, and so on, right? So the fact that the committee said no, and they voted about 90% of the members voted against that is efficacious and that is safe. So I was shocked when I heard it. I couldn't believe that this happened. But it was really interesting because the deliberation of the committee was extended to bring voices also from the public. Normally, there is a very short period of time that public entities can enter into this discussion. But there is a very active group of researchers which are not against psychedelics, but they are against how psychedelics are taken up as commercial entities and how the clinical trials are not diligent, and how there was sexual abuse during clinical trials, and all the consideration and how those were being silenced by MAPS researchers. So they asked FDA for extending the time for submission from the public. So there were numerous submissions from veterans, but also from this entity, Psychedelia Symposia. And in the end, the rejection happened. The rejection was not binding FDA, so FDA could still decide in favor of MAPS, but ended up supporting the decision of the committee. The sad thing is that members of symposia received death threats and so on. There was like really huge hate campaign against them because they were perceived as those stopping treatment, like, the most innovating treatment. But they were basically raising concerns that, there's not enough safety data, there is not enough thought put into those therapies that can be detrimental when not regulated properly, right? What was also shocking that this decision happened because in 2017, MDMA for PTSD received the status of breakthrough therapies from FDA, which means that it's comparing to other treatment, it has huge potential. Critical researchers talk about how this status is often based on insufficient data, not good quality of data. But the fact that it received was again like making those hype even more prominent and this kind of optimism even uncontested, right? Like we're going to get it basically. So what this decision can tell us is about how it is difficult and to trial therapies that are not conventional therapies, meaning that they are even meet strictly the objective of clinical trials, but they bring extra pharmaceutical and pharmacological factors. So I don't know how many of you are familiar how psychedelic assisted therapies are conducted. Should I explain it? Okay, so I'll just tell you how the protocol for MAPS looks like. So psychedelic assisted therapy, you can see the slide on my right, involves two therapists being present. There's a person laying, and there are different stages. So first, the person who is admitted to this trial will meet with a psychotherapist for introductory sessions. So those will be usually 60 minutes, twice, probably. Then over the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, there will be session again, meeting with therapists, but then will be experimental session following the meeting. And the experimental session will be when the psychedelics will be administered, and the lasting effects of hallucinogenic kind of state would be between 6 to 8 hours, and then the person is required to stay overnight in the clinic, and then next day the person should come for integration session, right? And this repeats in the protocols for MAPS twice. And after 3.5 months, the person comes again for a kind of like debriefing and the final integration session. So it's an ongoing process over weeks, and the integration, introduction, and the experimental session are kind of blended in a way. So this is very specific, as you can see already, how it differs from the regular administration of drugs, right? When you give a pill and then the person goes home. Here is lots of moving elements, as you can see, when it comes to assessing efficacy of this clinical, of this intervention. So putting aside that there are lots of very valid concerns about converting psychedelics into medicine, and those are involving how indigenous populations have been using psychedelics for centuries, are being displaced, how their knowledge is extracted from them, how their inclusion into development of clinical trials, but also from those commercial entities, very tokenistic. How those therapies are going to be very socially stratified. They are expensive, right? About $10,000 if you have to pay out of pocket, because they involve so much human work involved, right? So those are very valid concerns, but in this talk, I'm just going to focus on clinical standards. So psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapies challenge the biomedicine-grounded model for drug testing in numerous ways. Some major concerns raised by advisory committee during the deliberation and voting include functional blinding, the drug effectiveness versus I lost my drug effectiveness versus psychotherapy, the biases in recruitment, negative reporting, and durability of data. So I'm just going to focus on four, on the extra pharmaceutical factors such as setting, integration, and the role of the therapy, how it kind of complicated the assessment of efficacy. So So one of the challenges that as a clinical trialist using psychedelics for the regulation for MDMA faced was a problem with blinding. So clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, depend on the fact that you have a control group and you have a placebo group, and you randomize select people to different groups, and none of the groups should know that is having the medication given, right? So the placebo is really important. So in terms of pills, there's often sugar pill, and the effects shouldn't be recognized. With psychedelics, it's problematic because they create these hallucinogenic effects. So there were different ways, and you can look on the social media, and there's a very funny cartoon of 5 people sitting and other people dancing, and the sitting people is like, I guess we are in a placebo group. So this is a real problem because FDA and the committee basically said that participants knew, therapists knew, and assessors knew. And even though MAPS tried to develop different strategies how to minimize this problem, it came up first with the sugar pill. It didn't work. Then it started giving smaller doses of MDMA, but it's again problematic because smaller doses produce different effects, right? They still produce effects, but different effects. So the problem of blinding was a huge problem because FDA basically and the committee said, well, we cannot assess efficacy if we don't know, if people knew. And the problem with biases is related to it because many of the participants in clinical trials were also recruited from supporters of those therapies. So if you in support and if you know that you have it, you more likely report positive effects, right? So this is one problem. And the randomization, again, is kind of related to, they knew where they were located, in which trial group. Another was extra pharmacological factors, such as set and setting. So this is term specific to psychedelics, but I think it can be also used for, like when Jennifer was talking about this, this artificial, right? Because it's kind of about setting. So set is about what kind of like mental state of mind you bringing to the therapy, right? So it can affect how much it's going to affect what kind of effects can produce. But setting is about the direct way of understanding setting is about how the room is decorated. Right, whether it kind of like has ambiance feeling, whether it kind of relates to your cultural sensitivity, what kind of music is played. But social researchers also talk about setting is not just about the material content of the room, it's about also policies, right? Like, so it's like broader social assumption that you bring to the therapy. Whether, for example, you're coming from unprivileged groups or groups that are stigmatized in terms of drug use, you may be bringing this kind of stereotypes unintentionally even as a part of your setting, how safe you will feel and what kind of reaction you may have. Also, clinical trials revealed, and is known also from the previous decades, that even with the same person in the same setting, you may have very different reaction. The therapy may go very differently, right? So those are very moving parts that is not very easily to capture in those positivist approaches to clinical trial, that you have to eliminate all these moving parts and just make causation, that this medication causes this specific effect. And another contestation was about the role of therapists, right? To what extent can we assess the working of the compound, of the substance, and to what extent the therapist is actually contributing to the effectiveness of these therapies, right? And how do you disentangle it? And again, this would be problematic, and I will talk, because the whole idea of psychedelic assisted therapies, that they are therapeutic intervention as a total intervention, right? It's not just therapeutic aspects of compounds and therapies. But the committee wanted to know how each part compares to effectiveness. So this created significant problems, and I just going to go right into the how it did affect afterwards. Well, those kind of comments from the committee and those problems were known before. They just became kind of made very concrete during this deliberation. So what happened after the FDA decision? Some companies went very pragmatic. So Lycos and MAPS decided probably this is going to happen. They are going to just remove the therapy aspects completely. So they are going to go regulate just the compound, and then they are going to develop this kind of safe application of this compound in clinical setting. And why I'm saying it? Because they appointed as a regulatory officer a person from Johnson & Johnson, from Big Pharma, a person who already did this kind of maneuver when it comes to esketamine. Other companies are trying to develop compounds without hallucinogenic effects, right? So they just want to have, like, avoid this hurdle of saying that about the state of consciousness, about the problems with potential sexual assault, problems with therapists, and so on. So they just want to remove this. Other researchers are trying to expand and modify the standards for clinical trials, so they are more kind of sensitive to those specific of psychedelics, or change to products development standards. But I think what we in terms of, like, bringing about of theory, as Lucy wanted, I think we can look for science and technology scholars and their insight about hybridity, and how actually what we see as science in the context of regulation is not really the science that you know from kind of laboratories. This is a hybrid science that is neither law nor science. It's something different, because this science is confined by the premises and the containment of this regulation and the containment of clinical trials, right? So as you, the Bruno Latour book about laboratory life shows how the science is very unpredictable, changing, contingent. But the context of clinical trials, you have to make it really straightforward, like extract everything that can, like, be messy, unpredictable. So I think, like, if we think through this kind of hybridity, then the next step could be, what are the pathways? Should we kind of develop pathways that can appreciate this commodity? And if we don't, what are we losing? Like, if the companies will go just the mainstream, the most easy way to approve, the whole, I think, beauty and what many psychedelic researchers will argue is about this kind of the therapeutic aspect, the conscious, the alteration of ego concept, right? This kind of elements of working with the mind. But if we are moving it, what are we losing? Are we, like, really fostering innovation, or are we just going pragmatic and perpetuating, the mainstream way of doing science? So I would like to leave you with that. Thank you.
So there's someone up here at the front keeping time, and there's these like lovely signs, and it's very Canadian because the last sign is like, stop, please. But thank you for this wonderful talk, and we'll hold questions until the next two speakers have gone. I believe we have Dr. Sikstrom, Laura Sikstrom next. So I'll do Laura's bio here. So Laura Sikstrom is a medical anthropologist and scientist at the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Her research examines how artificial intelligence and predictive models are integrated into clinical workflows using ethnographic methods to interrogate equity, values, and the human dimensions of algorithmic decision-making. So welcome, Laura.
Hi, thank you. So this is my first law conference, and so I think to kind of situate why I'm here, here's next. Oh, that's very bright. I'll just introduce myself. So my name is Laura Sikstrom, as Jillian said, and this is, what I'm gonna talk about today is violence risk prediction in acute psychiatry. And this is a project we've been working on for about 5 years. It's had a lot of hands and eyes on it. In particular, I wanna thank Juveria Zahir, who's the medical head of the emergency department at CAMH, my lab co-lead, Marta Masley. So all this work has been done with her. Sophie, who will help with the legal analysis today, and a clinician scholar fellow, Andrew Lee, who could not be here, but leads the final phase of this project. So essentially, we've been working on this project, and we're like, there's a lot of legal implications of this work. We're not lawyers, we don't understand them, and so I think, right, I'm here to learn. Please tell me what we should be thinking about in this context. All right, so just a brief outline. I'm gonna talk about standard practice now, which are clinical violence risk assessment practices. I want to briefly touch on the state of adoption with AI, like where we're at, and then conclude with some conversation about the ethical and legal implications of these tools. All right, so violence risk prediction. I think, we're all aware that violence has adverse outcomes for patients, providers, and institutions, right? So common strategies to manage this risk in inpatient units are coercive and can be re-traumatizing, like restraints, mechanical restraints, can also create more intense forms of care. It contributes to moral injury and burnout for staff. And then for institutions, there's the liability risk, of course, that they would love to avoid. Current clinical assessments have known limitations, so between 23 and 50% of assessed as high risk do not go on to become violent. It's complicated because it can be efforts to de-escalate a patient. So, it's not necessarily that the scale is wrong. It could be that the staff are just really good at managing that risk. But again, it does tend to overestimate it. And so within this context, around 2019 when we started this work, there was a lot of conversation in the computer science world, like, hey, maybe we can enhance these risk assessments with machine learning. And for those who are maybe not familiar with AI, AI is a big bucket term for a lot of different techniques. And what I'm talking about here is machine learning, which is a tool where you take a lot of data to predict a behavior outcome. So it can be to predict, like, you're gonna do well in this treatment or not, or you're, maybe very likely to have ADHD or you're not. In this case, the outcome is, like, are you likely to become violent within the next 24 hours? So it's an imminent risk that we're interested in. Okay, so I just briefly want to touch on the method because this relies on something we developed called computational ethnography. And so this involved shadowing nurses in the emergency department, so more than 300 hours. It involved interviews with staff and patients around how they experience the management of this risk. And then it involves fairness metrics. So we built a machine learning model to evaluate it for fairness, and I'm going to talk about that today. We never had the intention of deploying this model. I just want to be clear. We were never doing it, but other people are, as you will see. Okay, so how does clinical risk assessment work? It works differently in different hospitals, but for the most part, a lot of hospitals use a structured clinical rating scale. At CAMH, where I'm based, they use something called the DASA, which is the Dynamic Appraisal of Situational Aggression. This is a tool primarily used by nurses, and we have Jillian here who has used this tool many times. And essentially, a nurse observes certain behaviors like irritability, impulsivity, documents this information, and then there's a daily risk score that's generated. For clients who have a risk score of 2 and above, the goal is to identify certain strategies, like to develop a care plan to manage that risk. So one thing we were interested in is like, are there, well, maybe I'm trying to remember the flow here. Let me see. Oh yeah. So let me walk you through it. Yeah. So routine clinical interaction, like, no, I don't want to do that, gets documented into the electronic health record, ideally every 2 to 3 hours, but that's not always how it works. This information is reviewed by a nurse around 5 a.m. every day. So they take their 12-hour shift and the previous 12-hour shift to generate this score. This information is combined with other information. So you can go into the electronic health record and look through Connecting Ontario to see old historical information, like perhaps a violent event at another hospital. And this information is used in combination with a lot of other information to decide what the care plan is. A 25 and 2 is a colloquial term for a PRN, which for those who might know, it's like a pro-nata medication, which is a very common risk management strategy. Okay. All right, so we were curious, like, hey, so computer scientists want to develop a machine learning model to predict this risk, but they're going to be using electronic health record data, which we know is probably biased. Let's see what the false positive assessment is on the DASA, in particular at our hospital, and are patients of different races, ethnicities, genders being falsely, are we overestimating the risk for some people based on these factors? I'll just add that we're lucky at CAMH because CAMH routinely collects sociodemographic information, so we could do this analysis. Most hospitals do not. Okay, so the paper's published, our student Chris Dharma published it. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is a huge surprise. It shouldn't be, but racially marginalized patients are more likely to receive a false positive assessment on the DASA or to have this risk overestimated. But I think what is interesting as well for us on that finding is that when you adjust for admission mode or housing status, that risk is attenuated or disappears for these same groups. So essentially what we think this means is that a lot of this bias that we're seeing in the hospital comes from systemic factors like poor housing, lack of access to primary care, racialized forms of policing. So they're kind of ending up in the hospital as a downstream factor. Okay, so yeah, that's not great, right? If you took this data and built a machine learning model, not so great. But how does the bias get in there, right? Like, I think sometimes people assume it's like really racist staff that are like, subjectively deciding. And I would argue that strongly probably against that idea, that I think these are much more systemic issues. And to give you an example of this, I just want to talk about, obviously our findings really showed that the presence of police at admission had a huge impact on these assessments. And so to give you an ethnographic example, right, I talked about how we, staff document routine interactions with patients, but police at admission share information that's called collateral with staff that gets documented in the electronic health record. So they might say something like, oh, he managed to bite me even while handcuffed. That's like documented. That might be used to generate the DASA. Then that information also circulates verbally in staff meetings that are used to create a risk management plans, right? So the presence of police at admission is like one of those factors that always comes up. But then it's also used to sort of manage staff and patient safety. And the qualitative part that's not here is how a lot of these changes in behavior are pretty minor, like maybe just staying further back from a patient or being a bit more cautious or going with another colleague. But for the patient, they can be experienced as like a bit of an othering experience. And so there is a question here of like, if you're going to overestimate this risk for vulnerable patients, like how does that alter this care experience for a lot of people? So, all right, so I guess the, bias, it's bad, right? From a fairness, equity perspective, this isn't great. So if you're going to take this data to build a machine learning model, which is how it works, you should be very careful about doing so, right? And so this is the next step of the project, right? Where let's think about, well, what are people doing with this data? Who's building models? Where are they being implemented? And I think I'll just add that there's kind of two stakes on this, right? There's this idea that like biases are baked into models, so they shouldn't be used, but there's also this idea that bias, people are biased anyways. Maybe the model will do a better, less idiosyncratic job than people. I think both of these things are true, right? Okay, so the current state of adoption is that there are lots and lots of models have been developed, enough that there are 2 systematic reviews already published. And there are, within the last year, a number of pilot studies that have been published, like in Zurich, in the Netherlands, Duke Hospital, Waypoint. Pilots are happening. The evaluations of these pilots it's not totally clear whether they work. And there definitely has not been any robust sort of health equity fairness assessment done of these models. Okay, and so, we also were like, hey, what would happen if we took this data and we built a model? So we built a model and we tested for what's called the false positive prediction rates between patient groups. And we did this assessment by the same thing that we did with the previous one. And again, AI, if you just deployed it as is, you would definitely end up with, what is called a false positive rate. You can see that admission by police is the #1 factor that leads to a false positive assessment. People are unhoused, Black, Middle Eastern, living in supportive housing, and so on. So training machine learning models on biased data leads to bias prediction. I think this is fairly obvious, but there is no, of course, like regulation to enforce any of this, right? Which is kind of why we're here. Okay, so then the question becomes like, well, let's just put a human in the loop. And you can see that like regulatory frameworks are moving in this direction, right? So the idea that physicians maintain responsibility for clinical interpretation and management is what the Royal Colleges say. And if you look, is anyone familiar with the COMPASS recidivism tool in the US? Maybe? This was like a big deal because it was like a tool that was being used in court to decide if someone got parole or not, and was found to be biased, but a court in Wisconsin ruled that this tool could still be used as long as the judge like used their discretion. Right, so I think this is like kind of where we're going here. So we're like, oh, let's actually test that idea, right? So Marta, who led this part of the work, was like, let's do an experiment and see, will having a human in the loop safeguard against biased AI? So she ran a decision-making task, recruited people on MTurk. If you're familiar, I'm not a psychologist or experimental psychologist, but Marta is. And presented information that was biased for certain patient groups. And we don't need the details, but the point is that it did not safeguard against, the human did not use their judgment in an appropriate way and make less biased decisions. So then in this literature, it's like, well, okay, maybe the human just needs a nudge. Maybe if we design the computer interface to like provide the information in the right way and nudge them in a specific direction, maybe we can like shape the outcome that we want. So we tested a lot of different features like anthropomorphism, the emotions, framing, and certainty scores, everything. I'm just only going to mention this one, which was around something called like cognitive forcing. So basically like delaying the recommendation to make the person taking this call think about the outcome, right? No, it didn't work. It's like the long and short of it. Like this feature did not actually force people to make less biased decisions, right? So I guess this idea that biased humans plus biased data, biased AI overseen by biased humans equals biased decisions, right? So this idea that we'll just like let a clinician decide is probably like not the way to go. Okay, so this brings us to this question of like, well, what are the ethical and legal implications of all this? And I'll just put a plug in for my student Andrew because he's about to do interviews. So if there are any CCB board members here or psychiatrists interested in this, feel free to reach out. He'd be very happy to talk to you. We're also doing a scoping review, asking these questions. And another student of mine who's back there, Lucas, built an ethical framework to support decision-making around this in healthcare systems, which we'll also be doing some focus groups on. So I'm gonna pass this over to Sophie to do a bit of a legal analysis for us, and that would be helpful. Thank you.
By legal analysis, I mean I'm going to take 2 minutes to just ask some questions. So thank you, Laura, for that presentation and so I've just recently joined this project, super interesting. And one of the next phases is to look at the legal and ethical implications. And so we're just launching this inquiry, but some of the questions that I think we need to ask are around, so if we start by thinking about what are the interests that are implicated in the use of this kind of tool, these won't come as any surprise, but of course liberty is implicated. A person might be formed or not based on an assessment of risk. There might be a decision around restraints, clear liberty interest there. Equality, when we're talking about bias, it's obvious, we're also talking about equality. And then safety and well-being and the regulation around safety is at issue because, biased tools aren't necessarily just potentially discriminatory, but they could be unsafe. If there's something that is actually not matching the needs of the person, we could be, going down into unsafe territory. So this is by no means comprehensive, but some of the things I think we need to be asking, when we talk about liberty, of course, Section 7 of the Charter comes up. Now, this is clinical care. The lawyers in the room will know that the Charter only applies to government conduct. Hospitals have been subject to the Charter, but it's a bit of a nuanced analysis. It needs to be a decision that is sufficiently governmental in nature. And so, could be that this isn't something that would be subject to Charter scrutiny, that it's something, determined to be more about the delivery of care. On the other hand, if there is an institutional decision to adopt a certain approach, a kind of policy decision, we're veering a little bit closer to the kind of realm where Charter might apply. You've already heard today about UWERT, and so that, just a reminder, is the case from the Supreme Court of Canada in 2018, where a Métis man argued that the actuarial tool, so this wasn't AI, but sort of a sign of what's to come, so that actuarial tools that didn't take into account his demographic data necessarily would discriminate against him and also lead to a Charter violation, Section 7 Charter violation. So the court rejected that Charter claim, but he won on other grounds, statutory grounds, but they rejected the Charter claim, but it was really, it looks from a read of the decision, it looks like it was on evidentiary grounds. They basically said, well, there isn't really clear evidence that there was this kind of impact on him. So, they didn't go very far down that line of analysis, but where here we have people doing really excellent work gathering this data. And so I think it potentially changes the analysis of, at what point is the evidence sufficiently clear to say, no, this is actually just discriminatory. And then on Section 7, so, restrictions on liberty in mental health care have been tested under the Charter in different forms, you've heard today the law is different in every province. In Ontario, those laws have been upheld. Again, though, I think if we know the law is really biased and not really matching the circumstances of the patient, there's maybe a problem with the principles of fundamental justice. It starts to be arbitrary. There's a principle of arbitrariness that is implicated in Section 7. So these are just, very kind of off-the-cuff thoughts of the kinds of analyses that might be implicated. Another is the physician and institution liability in tort. So the clinicians in the room will know there's a duty of care. This is a case that Jennifer Chandler actually drew my attention to, thank you, which is Dr. X versus Everson. And it's a little bit older, but the court found that failing to take a proper assessment of the defendant in deciding to form him was problematic. It wasn't a sufficient inquiry under the Mental Health Act, and that physician was liable for both negligence and false imprisonment. So what do you do then if you think about that analysis and a physician is using a super biased tool that perhaps they know to be biased and deciding to form the person? Is there a heightened risk of liability in that circumstance? These are questions we just don't have answers to at the moment. And just that last bullet is a nod to the tension here. Laura reminded me that there are all kinds of, there's sometimes legal action within institutions on the part of staff regarding the requirement to keep them safe. And so there always is going to be some balancing of those competing obligations. And that's all I'm going to say about the law. I don't know if you want to pick up anything else.
No, I just have to thank our funders for a variety of portions that went over for the last 5 years. So thank you, and look forward to questions and learning more from this group. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, we have the same presenter, kind of, next. One of the same presenters. You will know Sophie Nunnelley. And so Sophie Nunnelley is an assistant professor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her research explores health and mental health law, legal capacity, human rights, and the regulation of AI in healthcare, with a focus on equity and patient rights. And you will remember her from yesterday and throughout the day today.
Thank you. Sorry. Guess I'll set up here. Okay, hi. Changing topics a little bit, but not completely. I'm going to talk some more about AI, but more specifically, I'm going to talk about how the integration of AI into mental health care in different ways might change the way we think about informed consent. We've talked a lot this last 2 days about coercion and rights and consent. And so this doesn't really touch on that whole debate. There's obviously a lot of involuntary care in mental health care, but a lot of mental health care is consent-based. It's voluntary. It's people going for either inpatient or outpatient voluntary mental health services. And so that's the arena I'm mostly thinking about here. And so I'm gonna we all have heard of AI at this point. We know what that is. I'm gonna say 2 words about what is AI, how it's being used in mental health care. Again, super general or broad overview. And then a very brief primer on what's informed consent, just so we're all on the same page. And then mostly I'm gonna talk about how I think the use of AI is challenging our consent frameworks. And I'll make that point in 3 different contexts: direct to consumer AI tools, AI for clinical decision support, and then digital therapeutics. So this is a definition of AI from the British NHS. It's just the use of digital technology to create systems capable of performing tasks commonly thought to require human intelligence. That's a very general definition. As Laura said, it's a big basket of tools. Machine learning is AI that continuously learns and changes without being pre-programmed to do so. And so it creates some possibility. It's a very exciting technology, but it also inserts a degree of uncertainty for those using it, which becomes important for legal reasons. And then generative AI, we've all heard of ChatGPT, other ML tools that are generating content, image generators, or I'm going to talk a lot about chatbots. So how is AI being used in mental health care? All over the place. I mean, I have read some research suggesting that uptake on the part of mental health professionals has been a little lower than other health professionals, maybe for obvious reasons. Nonetheless, the field is changing rapidly. There is a whole range of use cases, from research to health system efficiency, so triage in emergency departments. System navigation is an important one, matching people to services in their areas. Prevention, diagnosis, when we start to trigger those obligations of informed consent. So this is just to highlight that even in those 3 use cases, there are different delivery mechanisms. So there's direct-to-consumer tools and tools that are delivered with a health professional in the loop. We often use the language of in the loop. But again, that changes the legal relationships and the liabilities and the responsibilities. So that becomes important. Okay, informed consent. We all know a little bit about what informed consent is. We talk a lot about consent in AI and healthcare, but most of those conversations are about privacy. And for good reasons. There are very critical privacy issues. But a lot of those conversations we're saying, when is there a requirement of consent to collect, use, and disclose personal health information? I'm not talking about that today. I'm talking about consent to treatment. Likewise, there are big conversations about the ethical requirements of consent where AI is used. Very important conversations, not what I'm talking about today. I want to talk about what is required in law. Okay, so just narrowing a little bit the field. What does the law require? As I said, health providers in the room will know this, probably many of the lawyers and many of us we've all been patients. There's no treatment without consent. I'm putting aside here the mental health acts and the circumstances where that can happen. But outside of that context, there's no treatment without consent. Now, important to this, I can't go, yes, I can. Important, so this is Ontario's legislation. Some of the other provinces also have legislation. Some provinces operate under the common law. General principles are more or less the same. There's some differences in Quebec, which I won't get into. But note the requirement that I bolded here. There has to be a health practitioner proposing a treatment. And then what is a treatment? It's defined quite broadly. A lot of different things can be treatments. This, again, is the Healthcare Consent Act in Ontario, and it does not include treatments that pose little or no risk of harm. So this becomes important in a minute. What do we have to disclose for informed consent? Risks, benefits, the nature of the treatment, alternatives, and consequences of not having the treatment. So nature of the treatment and those expected risks and benefits. And the standard of disclosure on those issues is what's called a subjective objective standard. It means it's the information that a reasonable person in the patient's circumstances would want to know. Okay, so that's all just a general primer. Big consequences for not getting appropriate informed consent, of course, for the patient or service user, but also for the clinician who could be liable in tort, in either the tort of battery if there's no consent at all, or in negligence, medical malpractice if there's some consent, but the disclosure of information isn't to the appropriate standard, and there's other elements of the test that have to be met, but the point here is just that there's some potential risk there. So what does AI mean for all of this? That's just a very kind of high-level overview. The question hasn't received all that much attention. This first quote I have here is from 2020. That's Glenn Cohen in the US. I think it's changed a little bit. There's been a bit more attention, but still not as much as you might think. And as I said there on the second bullet, often those conversations are about information and privacy. And yet, I think when we are in this world of insufficient services and people are saying, hey, maybe we can use AI to fill service gaps, maybe we're gonna, help with the inaccess to mental health care, we should be asking the consent questions, but also the broader kind of autonomy questions. Is especially these direct-to-consumer mental health tools, is rolling those out going to increase access and autonomy and give people some agency over their own care, or are we kind of relegating people to untested apps and sort of downloading responsibility? So questions here that should be asked, I think, critically. And consent is part of this inquiry, I would suggest. So this slide is just this was a bit of a controversy a couple of years ago. COCO is a peer-to-peer tool, but it includes an AI element to it. And so the founder was sort of announcing on Twitter, he thought this was an impressive thing, that look, I ran this experiment and 4,000 people received AI-generated therapy and they didn't even know. Isn't that impressive? And people, as you can imagine, were upset by this, that there hadn't been any consent. So there's, again, this inattention to the consent questions. All right, so the three contexts I want to talk about is first, direct to consumer. So chatbots have been in the news a lot lately. A lot of those stories have to do with what I'm calling general purpose chatbots or entertainment chatbots. So the chat GPTs, the replica AIs, the character AI. Does anyone know what these are? There have been some lawsuits. They've been all over the place. So those are really important to think about because people are turning to those for their mental health care, which is problematic for lots of reasons. But there's this other category of chatbots that are actually designed and intended for mental health support. And so these are not chosen scientifically. Abby and Uper, they're just a couple that I put on there. This is about the entertainment chatbots. I'll just pause, come back to this for a second and note, they're quite confusing sometimes. So character AI, you can choose a persona to interact with. You may have seen this before, but when you look at it, it's quite remarkable. So this is a psychologist character. There's no psychologist involved in this at any point. And there's a little bit of fine print under that says this is not a real person or licensed professional. And then underneath, hello, I'm a psychologist. So it's a little concerning that this is happening. WISA is an example of a mental health chatbot, very popular, 6.5 million users. Nod to my excellent RA Shafiq here who did this, got these stats for me. But it seems to be very popular. It's been adopted by the NHS, and so lots of support for this. Now, and it used to be, or is in part rule-based, not Gen AI. They have now rolled out a Gen AI version that is built on one of Open AI's models, so sort of a chat GPT, I guess. I'm not 100% clear on the tech end of things. So I guess my question would be, if you go to your psychotherapist or your psychologist or some regulated professional for therapy, you would have to give your informed consent. So what happens if you go to WISA? Well, if you think back to the legislative scheme, that quick overview, is there a health practitioner? Basically, a health practitioner in law is a regulated health professional, someone who's a member of one of those colleges. And I'm going to show you that there isn't. Is there treatment? Well, it's quite ambiguous as to whether there's treatment. And is there a risk of harm? Well, there does seem to be some evidence of possible harms here. So on the health practitioner, some of these are just direct to consumer. It's all a bot, no people involved, clearly no health professionals. Others, so WISA does actually give you the option. You can pay for an add-on where you interact with a human. But even here, they have different terms. So there's emotional well-being professional, coach. Sometimes they use the word therapist. But they don't claim that this person will be credentialed in your jurisdiction. Or even say specifically what their credentials are. And so you have to look at their terms of service, which say a WISA coach or therapist is not a replacement for therapy, does not provide medical diagnosis or treatment, and it's just support. So they really use the language of support. They also use the language of self-help, coaching, guidance, and that's very careful language. It's language that is designed to work with the reality that it's not FDA approved, it's not Health Canada approved, it's not a medical device in any jurisdiction. Now, WISA did receive what's called breakthrough device designation by the FDA, which means it had a fast track. There was evidence behind it, or is evidence behind it, and it received some fast tracking, but as far as I know, it still has not been approved by any regulator as a medical device. So it's still in this kind of nebulous self-help wellness kind of arena. There's just another one I thought was interesting, therapy reimagined, and then in the Q&A, is this therapy? No. it's quite misleading, I would suggest. So is there risk? Well, there's been a lot of talk of failures in risk detection. So the person comes with is in crisis, and will the chatbot pick up on that where there's no human, as well as inappropriate responses. So this was my I've been having fun interacting with some of these chatbots, and so this was I screenshotted these off my phone, and so I can't. My glasses here, but I said, I'm wondering who I can call if I'm in trouble. And it asked me, who do I turn to for support? What resources are there if I'm in crisis? And it suggested a tool to help me feel more grounded. I said, no, I need a crisis line. And it offered me mindfulness or some, other things. I kept going. I said, I need someone to call. It asked me about if I've thought about local helplines. Great, it's, catching on. I said, yes, but I don't know any numbers. And then it kind of regressed and told me, maybe we can help me feel more relaxed. I got really expressed and I said, do you have any crisis phone numbers for me? I'm in Canada. And it really, offered me a locus of control exercise. So that's really concerning. I did eventually notice that there was an option, I don't remember how I came to this, but you could put in #SOS and it generated this list, so great. But it took way too long and I needed to know where to go, and I was not in crisis and I still didn't see that for a long time. So risk of harm, especially where this is intended to be a gap filler for people who might not have access to human care. This is another example of risk. So there was a chatbot called Tessa developed by the National Eating Disorders Association in the UK. I understand it was initially rule-based, and it decided to incorporate generative AI, and then it began to offer weight loss tips. And was quickly taken down. So there is potential for real harm for some of these tools if there aren't sufficient safeguards. So back to my question, is there, okay, thank you. Is there a requirement for informed consent? Well, this is what looks, I think, a lot like treatment, although they're not really calling it treatment for legal reasons. There's no regulated health professional. And so there's not really a scheme of informed consent here. Instead, we're in this private law world of contractual terms and conditions. Contract law is designed to have two people with equal bargaining power negotiate the terms of their arrangement. That's not what healthcare is, right? And so, and yet we're in this world, and so I don't mean to pick on WISA. WISA is just one that I looked a lot at, and it's used a lot, and it actually does seem to have some research behind it. But we shouldn't have to, I would suggest, as consumers of mental health services, go and do the research to know if something is evidence-based. So these are the terms and conditions, and it says, WISA clinicians review the Gen AI to make sure it's safe, but they make no promises or guarantees and will not be responsible for any special, indirect, or any damage that might happen because of WISA plus service. So it's very different from the fiduciary duties that exist for health professionals, right? Okay, I'll be quicker on the other two use cases for AI. The second one is clinical decision aids. So what I mean here is AI tools that help clinicians with intake, with assessment. We heard about violence risk assessment. It's being used in suicide risk assessment, also diagnosis, recommendations of treatments. So here's an example. It's called Aphrid Health. It's a company in Montreal, and it has this tool. It uses AI to make recommendations for treatment with antidepressants and I think other therapies. And so they say they address the trial and error approach to medication selection that hasn't changed. So basically they're trying to say they'll help the clinician narrow in more quickly on an appropriate medical intervention. It achieved medical device licensure, which I think is really interesting. I don't know of any other, there might be others, I don't know of any other mental health AI tool that has received a medical device license in Canada. It's been rescinded. I actually messaged them to ask, and they responded, and they said they didn't have the budget for the auditing to keep up their license. I don't know more than that, but it's a very interesting example. So that's a decision aid tool. This is another one used in the UK. They claim 92% accuracy in identifying 8 common mental health disorders. It's meant to really aid the clinician. So, do you have to, as a clinician, tell your patient that you're using one of these? You're nodding? Maybe. People disagree. There isn't a clear answer in the literature. I don't think it's clear in law. The answer probably depends on how central the AI is to the clinical decision. But professional colleges have started to step in and provide some guidance here. And so this is the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Manitoba. And they say if Gen AI is used for clinical decision support, the registrant should disclose how it was used, its capabilities and limitations, safeguards, how you manage bias, ensure validity and reliability. So these are pretty significant obligations for a clinician that might not know anything about AI, right? I know a couple clinicians who are also computer scientists, but that's, shouldn't be the standard. So here's another one from the BC Association of Clinical Counselors that's actually even more the requirements are maybe more onerous. They're intended to be, they're told they should be able to explain in simple terms how the AI algorithm functions, how it makes decisions, how and why data is collected, where it's stored, whether the client's data is used to train the AI. So these are things that the average clinician might not know, and how, if this is the standard, and maybe it should be the standard, but then how are we going to train the clinicians? Okay, how much time do I have? 4 minutes, perfect. So prescription digital therapeutics is the third area I'm going to mention. So what I mean here is a digital tool that is used in healthcare with a prescription intended for treatment, evidence-based, and has a regulatory approval. So it's sort of like a drug, but it's a digital tool. Here's an example. This is, as I understand it, not based in AI, but it is a digital tool. This is 6 weeks of brain training exercises. It is prescription-based. It is used as alongside antidepressant medication for depression, major depressive disorder. So a patient can't access this directly. So what's required here? Well, clearly there's a health professional here that has consenting obligations. There is a treatment that's presumably not risk-free. So there's an obligation to get informed consent, but what does that mean? What does that informed consent look like? And what information has to be disclosed? And here again, I think some of those questions we asked in the previous category apply again. If you think back to that little primer on informed consent, you're supposed to disclose the nature of the treatment, expected benefits and material risks, among other things. So what is the nature of the treatment here? What do we need to tell the patient? How much do you need to know as a clinician about the AI? Glenn Cohen says, well, when a physician recommends aspirin, they don't tell the patient, they have no idea how it works. I don't know if that's true, that clinicians don't know how it works. But anyway, you rely on Health Canada drug approvals, right? You're not necessarily explaining the mechanisms of how the drug works. But what does it mean? What is the obligation for AI, especially where we don't have any AI law and we don't necessarily have the same kind of regulatory approvals at the back end? And then what are material risks? Are we talking only about health risks? Are we talking about privacy? Are we talking about algorithmic bias? Those things can intersect with safety risks. And again, how are we going to make sure that people even know that clinicians know these risks? So to recap, direct-to-consumer tools, I'd suggest we may be allowing people to use treatments without any meaningful informed consent. There are big questions around how we're going to think about informed consent in the other two categories, AI-powered decision support for clinicians and prescription digital therapeutics. So lots to be worked out. I think a really important consideration is we can't just think about consent on its own. It exists within a whole architecture of other law, including Health Canada approval of devices and drugs. If we're in the healthcare sphere, we have colleges, we have recognized ethical and legal duties on the part of healthcare providers. A lot of that architecture is still being built when it comes to AI. And so we need to build that architecture and make sure, I guess my plea is to make sure that as we do that, we think about the values we want to be front and center. Because designing the regulations does require that we make value choices. And so I think that idea of meaningful consent, which is ultimately about autonomy, needs to be front and center. Because at the moment, I think it looks a little bit like we are downloading that risk onto individual patients and clinicians. I think that's it. Thank you.
So at this point, I'm going to ask that our panelists come to the front. And I wonder if okay, good. I was going to say, close the presentation because it's like right in the face of the panelists. I have Zoom open here as well for those of you on Zoom and want to ask a question. I've got one, but I'm going to save it because we've got already someone here that is standing at the mic. So please go ahead.
Thank you. With all of these, I'm not a tech person either, but recently I was at a doctor and I was told ahead of time before going in that they would be using some recording, I don't know exactly what it's called.
AI scribe?
Yeah, I guess that's it, to kind of record our appointment. And I had to wait a few minutes and I kept thinking, well, I want to ask about that. And of course, then you go in and you see the nurse and I got distracted and I forgot. If this is sort of a recording of our appointment and some scribe is putting that into words into the note for the file, do we have a right to ask for a copy of that?
Well, I mean, you have a right to access your own healthcare record, and so I would think so. You own your own medical information, as I understand, or you have a right to request to see it.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking now it's so kind of instant and electronic. Like after your appointment, should they be able to just hit a button and send you a copy of what they have something has transcribed for us to check it? Because I know, having checked many health records for a family member, that there's lots of mistakes. And some are big ones and some are little ones, but we don't normally see that, for every appointment. And now I thought that it's so kind of instantaneous, it's almost like, why wouldn't we get a copy?
Okay, first is, yes, you can get access to your medical records, but I think for anybody who's tried, it's really hard. And Jillian has done some work on open notes that would be, maybe she wants to answer. But the second thing there is around like what AI scribes are being talked primarily about supporting physicians, because physicians have all this bureaucratic load and it's a ton of paperwork. But I wish there was more conversation around how they could support the Therapeutic Alliance for patients, because a lot of the patients we've talked to have described their admission to acute services It's like they can't quite remember because they were in such crisis and they were given a lot of information and they don't really remember. It's all blur. They would love to have a written summary of that encounter. So what you're describing is like, hey, I actually would love to also see it because it's hard to recollect every single detail. So I think and I'll just say Marta and I tried 2 or 3 times to win money to do something like that and have failed. But it's still on our agenda because I think that's exactly what patients are also see the value of these tools from their perspective to support communication amongst their family or with their physician. But yeah, in terms of open notes, Jillian would know a lot about that in the Ontario context. Yeah, yes. Yeah, well, and I'm.
Otherwise, the doctor's got to be back to you because they're typing on the
Yeah.
computer.
Well, I mean, my father was in the hospital for a year and there was like a big meeting with the OT and everything. And this is in Alberta, I couldn't go. And my brother recorded the meeting surreptitiously. So I'm sure patients are using their phones to record these meetings. So because they were felt really overwhelmed with the medical information. And so, yeah, I think I wish with the AI scribes, it wasn't so provider centric in this conversation as well. Yeah. But maybe you want to say something about open notes, Jillian, just briefly?
Yeah, there's this concept called open notes, and it's the idea of people who have gone in for service, who are patients, having access to their own health record and the notes. And the way we've seen it come to live here in Ontario and other parts of Canada has often been through a patient portal that not every organization has, and that many organizations that do launch it with or without the notes present or with some of the notes present. So in the US, there's a little bit more of a requirement for what has to go in these portals. Here, we get to choose as organizations what goes into the portal. That said, to the first point, patients do have the right to access their medical records, might be in paper form, and they also can go through a corrections process, because you mentioned mistakes. My age is wrong, and everything that is with my kids being born at Unity Health in Toronto, and I've actually asked for a correction, so I have empathy there as well. But I'm not supposed to be talking here. So we'll go to the next person.
I had a question for Laura and possibly Sophie. I was wondering if you have looked at, when we're doing risk assessment in these contexts, when these models are actually getting structured just for specific patient subpopulations. Because I think, having looked at the literature a bit, because I've been working on a sort of similar thing, looking at forensic psychiatry issues, I'm curious about especially the ones that look at schizophrenia spectrum disorder and the way that you've got overdiagnosis with some of those conditions that have obviously they're proxies essentially for protected groups. And so I'm curious to what extent you've looked at that as well in terms of thinking about some of the legal implications and how you generate these types of models if we're going to go that direction and use AI to be building risk assessment models. Yeah.
I think there's maybe 2 parts to your question. One is sort of the discrimination and disabilities stuff that you were talking about. But then the other piece is around how good are these models for different groups of people? And I guess the short answer is not great. So, but even the DASA itself was actually validated for forensics populations and not validated for other contexts, because the idea is that it's supposed to be used by clinicians where you have a baseline knowledge of the client, which is not the case in the emergency department necessarily. And then, of course, it's not great for people in withdrawal because you're typically irritable, which is one of the things on the scale. So anyways, I think, yeah, in general, the DASA is an imperfect tool on its own. Could AI do better is sort of the question that developers ask. They're like, maybe we could do better with this tool than what's happening clinically. I think that's an open question at this point still, because we could tinker with our model and probably improve its accuracy, right? But whether we want to is the bigger question. Yeah. But yeah, then I think the piece you're saying too is there's specific diagnoses that maybe this does work or doesn't work with. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly, right, if it overclassifies risk and you're applying it to particular subpopulations, you're going to hit anything that's a proxy for, right? And so that's, I'm just, yeah, I think that's actually a fairly significant concern, since right now I think a lot of research is very focused on schizophrenia spectrum disorder, and so I think there's a concern there.
Yeah, well, we have a student who was looking at this from the lens of autism, because autism would be like in machine learning speak as an unobserved characteristic. So it's typically not documented, or because the person might be undiagnosed. So the model might be picking up on things that we're unaware of, and that's like the black box element of this. So it's an open question and for that question. But yeah, like so a lot of the research is in schizophrenia or forensics, less so in like regular inpatient units. But yeah, just to say, these scales are widely used, right? Like they're very widely used. Yeah. Yeah.
Great, and I'm just checking Zoom here. I don't see anything from Zoom. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Somal, and I'm a psychiatrist as well as a bioethicist and an educator. My question is for Dr. Sikstrom, and this comes in the larger context of bias in medicine. We had a very difficult experience with educating or transferring skill sets to realize and detect implicit biases in emergency departments. It was not taken very well, no surprises there. But that had made me think about what could be the best ways to get the message through in terms of bias as it is, and your slides did point out towards how it kind of manifests in the emergency services. Is possibly AI tools the option, or in your research have you come across any strategies that address those implicit biases that come in interactions with clinicians, staff, and members? Because we encountered a closed door when we tried to tap on it and say, hey, there is bias, let's address that. But there was a lot of resistance, and I wonder if you had encountered that as well. Thank you.
I mean, my short answer, or longish answer to that would be that like racism in health is a big problem, but it's also maybe dependent on the clinical unit you work on and the sort of leadership and the decisions that take place. So I'll just say, like, the emergency department at CAMH has done a lot to have this conversation about race in particular. So they've hired staff they're very diverse. There's explicit conversations about race and racism amongst staff, especially around risk management planning. That all said, I'm always like poking them, because I'm like, what about gender? What about gender people? Because there is an element of gender that's sort of like taken for granted, in the way that there's more, at least in my context, there's an explicit effort to think about racism. But that said, like, yeah, there's a lot of education and training that can take place. But I would say my stance is that, if you follow around nurses for 12 hours a day for days, which I did, I'm like, it's a really hard job, right? So I don't want to download the systemic racism and inequality onto frontline providers. And not because the implicit racism isn't a problem, but also like, we have these other bigger issues, and I don't need to push all that onto people who are there day after day trying to do the best they can. So that's like kind of my short, like, philosophical stance. That said, we did win a CI Chart grant recently to think about how to redesign AI tools to support risk management planning with equity in mind. So that's the plan for the next 5 years, is to like do a bit of that prompting physicians to identify resources that are appropriate for different patient groups. Because if you think about the emergency context, they're dealing with so much diversity in patient experience, needs, presentations. It's a lot for staff. You have a lot of staff turnover at times, a lot of learners in this environment. It's a learning academic teaching hospital. So how do you like effectively develop risk management plans that support equity. So that's sort of our next plan, and to use AI to support that. But so we're taking a different angle, if that makes sense. But I'm happy to talk to you about that if you're interested. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Sangik. I'm a psychiatrist with a bit of curiosity in AI, and I've been using it both for research and obviously for other interesting activities and questions. I have a comment first, which is that in the context of AI and our relationship, obviously, with mental health and the law, and all of the above, I want to bring up computational psychiatry as a growing field in the sense that not only are we talking about informed consent, I think we are talking about at least 10 years into the future or even less, because if we believe all the AI specialists, it's actually growing at an exponential pace, not a linear pace, but an exponential one. So by next year, we should have moved multifold in terms of how at the back end it's developing. So what we should be looking at in the context of computational psychiatry, I've been wondering, kind of like RDoC in the US, where it's a reframing of not just the DSM as categorical aspects of our diagnosis, but symptom framework, behavioral science in its totality being pushed into a Gen AI system completely and comprehensively and integrated in terms of these systems with EEG, with MRI, with fMRI, that actually then builds on this process that isn't just medical devices, that at this point probably uses ChatGPT 3.5, so it gives us problematic algorithms that doesn't actually feedback that properly. But in the future, a few years from now, where literally general personal devices on our cell phones, and we talked about the dangers of social media, has that actual power to actually accumulate that data. You add a camera at a home, that's actually another kind of behavioral data. So I'm actually asking a question of health data in and of itself, because psychiatry in its intersections is going into behavioral sciences, not only psychopathology, but generally what influences these things. So it's not even a question of therapy per se, but if you're having a bad day, how does those emotional valences actually then become navigated because you turned on ChatGPT, who goes, oh, you're having a rough day. I can also provide you some therapy or options that are evidence-based, but I can also just have a chat with you in that kind of supportive frame. So my question is actually far grandiose in a way. Do you see that kind of process where not only at an individual level and not only at an institutional level, should we be considering a much kind of more dangerous and larger question where, is this a question of health policy and regulation of the AI itself? Because I think 10 years in the future, it won't be just about specific mental health therapy devices. In fact, the generative program right now probably can do it better than any of these medical devices that is owned by a couple of companies. So that's my first comment and question. A second question, actually, the CAMH study, I'm just curious because bias is the question, and if AI and Gen AI is neural networks, that actually mimics us, right? That reflective process that therefore also has the confabulatory, hallucinatory, lying properties of humans in that sense, and biases. The computer scientists and AI specialists have actually wondered on a statistical framing where we have to modulate bias with more AI specifically, right? Where in a standard deviation curve, you have actual like 10 different AIs that are auditing and the same machine learning that has shown this to therefore then say within a statistical curve, this likely is the veracity in based on or this is the data that is biased or non-biased, and we should maybe trust this data or not within a certain percentage. Has that been kind of the conversation in your wonderful kind of study as well?
Yeah, I think there's two questions. I see you answering some. Okay, the first thing is around bias and like how you manage that, and we'll use AI to manage bias. okay, yes, there's a way to quote de-bias models with like adversarial learning, and we could do that, right? And maybe create like a more fair model. But I think I come down to like, but that doesn't address any of the systemic problems our work identified, like a lack of housing, racialized policing, like it doesn't address any of the actual real problems. So that's not going to solve anything. So how I see it is like AI is a great pattern detector. What's a massive pattern, like social inequities, right? Like they're just, they're like fractures in our world. Well, great, AI is really great at detecting them, turns out. So that's how I would use it. I think it's actually got potential for that, but I don't see many people doing that. In terms of like, can you use like an agentic AI system to monitor? I mean, I suppose this is the question I have about regulation with like fair AI, is that why haven't we seen more movement on like protecting patients from these tools? Like I would say almost all the tools that are deployed in Canada have had no fairness assessment at all. Like they have no idea. And that's because I've asked the developers, they're like, no, we can't, all we have is sex. So like, where does that leave us, right? So I would say that would be my first step, is like having some evaluation standards for these models before deployment. And then your question about computational psychiatry and like how psychiatrists are gonna have like increasing amounts of information flying their way, right? Like wearable device, sleep information. This is what you're getting at, right?
No, and who actually owns that data?
Yeah.
Because it's actually, right now it's spread, but not even just the specific therapy chatbots per se,
Yeah.
because we're in the advent of this process, but Gen AI like ChatGPT that wants to create the AGI process that is far, supposed to be that super intelligence, quote unquote, but at that rate, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about multifold data of entire behavior that you could technically, push into such a computational power, right?
And like digital twins.
Yes, and basically and they're all in your cell phone.
Yeah.
Based on private access. So that access process isn't just about psychiatry in that sense, but it's always there, and it can integrate your MRI, it can integrate, in the future, if such things were to be. Then I guess my question isn't just about only informed consent, but if it's literally a personal handheld device, are we looking at, my question is really about the health data and the implications of who owns this data. And not even informed consent with a one-to-one relationship between you and a psychiatrist or a therapist or whatever, but literally you and your handheld device that has potentially the access to all that computational data in the first place. Yeah.
I think you're better to answer that question. I'll just say that I do think there's something interesting about the commercial determinants of health, and thinking about the way in Ontario our health system siphons off portions of our care to private actors. So like think about Life Labs or Shoppers doing our COVID vaccines. And this is the exact same question. Are they going to siphon off these possibilities to various private actors who then can do what maybe they own the data? I don't know. That's a great question. And maybe you want to take that answer.
I mean, there's so much in what you, in your comments and questions. So I don't know if I can do justice to it all, but I think if I read between the lines of what you're saying, it's sort of, here we are tinkering at the edges of, trying to make particular devices okay when there's this giant revolution happening, and in 6 months we're not going to recognize the landscape anymore. So, and I share those thoughts. So, I had one slide on people using ChatGPT and, those tools for mental health support, and we could see it as, that's troubling and move on. But it's actually a really, I think, significant shift in how especially young people are using digital tools, right? And so people are developing these mental health tools, but I don't know. People tell me, as I think they tell you, that there's going to be, the real power is going to be in this more in generalized artificial intelligence, so that the specialized tools sort of give way to models that can just do everything. And so then I don't know, what does that mean? What is what is health information and what is not health information. So a couple of years ago, I was on a workshop where we were talking about people using social media data for suicide risk prediction. And we had a conversation about, well, are there privacy obligations there? And the developer said, well, this is in the public domain. Like there's no privacy obligation here. And people were saying, is that right? Because now you're using it for a medical purpose with potentially quite significant implications. But this is maybe a cop-out, but I think AI is requiring that we maybe revisit all the definitional boundaries. It's certainly changing what we think about, what is a mental health problem, and what is treatment, what is care, who is authority. If your therapist is in your smartphone, so I don't have questions or answers to these questions, but.
If I may add,
Yeah.
there's a book written by Wendy Wong, and the book is, I think she wrote it like in 2024. It's called We the Data. And I think she kind of deals with the issues of where the data goes, who owns it, not specifically to medicine, but I think it could be informative.
I will just say one more thing, that I think that while we're not able to answer these big questions, we still do need to do the work of looking at what's in front of us and trying to address the regulatory gaps. And so we can't just throw up our hands. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one more short question. If there's a question from folks. Did I see a thumbs up, or was that you can ask? No. Oh, you're good. Okay. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Is there any privacy anymore? If it can read social media and then it knows who to target to send, pop-ups about small dogs or depression or whatever. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
Basically, what I was sort of gonna say earlier is, and I kind of sat down, he kind of touched on my thing about data. But one thing that's important and to note is when it comes to, from a lived experience, doctor's office, psychiatrist's office, data is only kept digitally and on paper for 7 years. So after 7 years, everything goes. You're back to ground zero. So if you're out of the system for like 7 years and you will go back into the system, there's that huge gap of nothingness. So it's one thing that I've been kind of pushing on digital health and EMRs is after 7 years, or 7 to 10, it's very institutionalized, the length of time our data is kept. But that's one, especially when us as patients are filling out PHQs every visit, and we use it as tracking our trends. And then all of a sudden we stop using the system, and then boom, it's gone for 7 years. Thanks.
Thank you for that comment. Okay, I actually think we're done this panel, although I think there was lots that we could have even kept going further there. I didn't even get to my question, so that's a good sign. Thank you very much.